If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I prepared especially for you. The town rested silent beneath a washed-out sky that weighed heavily on the rooftops. Dust drifted along the road in thin layers, scraping against boot soles and abandoned kegs. A sign for the tavern dangled at an angle, its links rattling gently whenever the breeze nudged it. Nobody was out except for her, positioned in the shadow of the general store's veranda, her arms crossed firmly as if guarding against more than just the warmth. She had been getting by alone on the edge of this spot for months, making do with whatever she could barter, repairing garments, fixing rooftops, laundering for the handful of cowpokes who still earned regular pay. The shack she occupied wasn't legally hers, but it was the only thing remaining after her spouse gambled away their property title and then disappeared into the wasteland. Every move she made in town was calculated. She was aware of the stares, the murmurs, the fellows who figured they could overstep with a lady fending for herself. She held herself keen like a knife displayed openly because anything gentler attracted problems far too fast. That morning, as a horseman emerged at the distant stretch of the trail, she sensed her gut clench. Outsiders never brought comfort. They carried obligations, inquiries, or something worse. The fellow approached at a leisurely pace, slumped in the saddle, his brim concealing much of his features. His mount appeared gaunt from long journeys, bones visible under a coat slick with perspiration. The nearer he got, the more the town appeared to pause, as if anticipating whatever burden he bore. He was a cowhand, obviously not one of the tidy sorts who stuck to reliable spreads, but the type who wandered, grime clinging to his garb, whiskers grown patchy, a pistol slung low on his belt. He swung down by the water trough with the rigidity of a person who hadn't rested properly in ages. His quietness wasn't timidity. It was the sort of hush that hinted at wariness, as if he'd discovered too often that opening his mouth first welcomed complications. She moved ahead before he could lift the pail. Dread churned in her breast. Dread that he was yet another guy who'd attempt to claim more than was his due. But she hid it behind a biting remark. "Cowboy!" she called, her tone sharp enough to cut through the motionless avenue. "Is your head always fixed between my thighs? Is that what leaves you so adrift out here?" The phrase escaped her lips faster than she'd planned. A challenge, a caution, perhaps even a silent appeal. "Don't gaze at me like the rest do. Don't force me to protect myself once more." She observed him intently for his response. If he chuckled, if he leered, if he advanced with that well-known strut, she'd pivot and depart before it escalated. Her fingers were rigid by her hips, prepared to shove, scratch, or grab for the blade she tucked beneath her sash. But he offered no reply whatsoever. He didn't even flinch. He merely dropped his gaze to the trough, pumped the lever until liquid flowed, then extended the pail to her ahead of himself. No grin, no slight, just an action that was straightforward and firm. For an instant, she felt her torso relax, though the strain didn't fully dissolve. She sipped, continuing to examine him, probing for the sort of person he might be. When the breeze changed, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She nearly rejected it, stubbornness lodging in her voice. But the reality was the arid chill bit deep, even beneath the midday glare. She maintained her head elevated, unwilling to let appreciation appear as fragility. But inwardly, she experienced something odd, a spark of understanding for this fellow who seemed more exhausted than threatening. He didn't hover near, didn't attempt to turn the deed into anything greater. He simply remained there, palms relaxed by his sides, gaze uneasy like someone scanning for phantoms. She understood at that point that he wasn't merely stopping for a sip. Fellows like him only entered hamlets like hers when they'd exhausted all other destinations. For him, the goal was basic. Keep going until he hit soil that didn't reject him. An old obligation trailed him and perhaps additional baggage. For her, endurance was the goal. Cling to the shack, ensure scraps on the plate, and guarantee nobody seized what scant possessions she retained. As the pair of them lingered on that gust-swept lane, each fatigued in unique manners, it was evident neither possessed much more to forfeit, and that, beyond any dialogue, clarified why neither chose to depart. The lady didn't reveal her residence immediately. She continued eyeing him as if assessing whether she could chance exposing the reality of her existence. A newcomer on a weary steed could spell peril or rescue, and far too frequently it had been the former. Yet, she recognized she couldn't haul water solo through another 7 days, and the shack's entrance pivot had been partially wrecked since the recent gale. After a prolonged silence, she offered a slight tilt of her head toward the dusty route exiting town. "If you're seeking a spot to weather the evening, come along," she stated, her words even, but not harsh. He pondered it, mouth set firm, glance darting once to the tavern where a pair of gents lounged on the railing, observing. He disliked how they followed her with their stares, as if anticipating whether she'd escort this wanderer. He showed them no response, merely shifted the reins and guided his horse behind her. Internally, he evaluated his options. He could press onward, venture into the barren land, bed down frigid on the earth, and rise with the identical void bearing down. Or he could trail this lady who had sliced him with her speech, but hadn't dismissed him entirely. For a man who'd been drifting excessively, the latter option seemed less like frailty and more like an opportunity to inhale. The trek to her dwelling was wordless, yet charged with unease. He observed how she kept peering back, inspecting the path. He interpreted the posture of her frame, erect, composed, but rigid with recollections of evenings when somebody had tailed her to her door. She provided no details, and he posed no questions, but he grasped sufficient. Upon arriving at the shack, the tale of her hardship displayed clearly. The structure tilted slightly eastward, planks faded to gray, the covering mended with metal panels nailed haphazardly. The grounds featured a shattered barrier, a pump with its cord worn to threads, and a hen enclosure lacking an entrance. She halted at the steps and folded her arms, awaiting his feedback. A portion of her braced for a grin or a critical comment. Males frequently judged her by what had been stripped away, not by what she'd succeeded in maintaining upright. But he merely eyed the entrance, observed how it drooped on a single pivot, and proceeded directly to it. Without inquiry, he placed a hand on the timber, gauged the heft, then knelt down. She furrowed her brow, surprised, but didn't intervene. From his pack, he retrieved a twisted spike he'd saved and a length of cord. Quietly, he began the task. His actions were consistent, practical, formed by routine. This wasn't the initial damaged entrance he'd endeavored to restore to function. She positioned herself in the threshold, arms remaining crossed, but her gaze mellowed as she observed longer. It was an unusual sensation. For months, she'd been anticipating someone to dismantle this spot, not reassemble it. She comprehended then that the fellow wasn't merely occupying the quiet. He was demonstrating his nature without voicing it. He didn't glance up at her until the pivot secured, the entrance opening more fluidly than it had in ages. "Improved," he remarked plainly, his tone deep and gravelly from lack of use. She gulped, divided between thankfulness and the dread of displaying it. Too many instances prior, she'd relied on such acts, only to uncover the price extracted afterward. But an element in his demeanor varied. He hadn't drawn near, hadn't requested a meal, hadn't even inquired why she resided out here by herself. She felt both disturbed and oddly comforted. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of old with smoke and boiled coffee. A small table stood against the wall, its surface scarred. A narrow bed pushed into the corner had a quilt patched so many times its original fabric could no longer be guessed. The shelves carried jars with little inside them. Beans, Athens scrape of flour, a nearly empty tin of coffee. She caught him taking in the room, and for a second shame pressed against her pride. "It's what I have left," she said bluntly, as if daring him to sneer. He shook his head once slow and said nothing. His silence didn't feel like pity. It felt like understanding, and that unsettled her even more. Questions lingered in the air unspoken. Who had left her here and why? Why was he drifting alone with nothing but a tired horse and silence tow his name? She wondered if he would ask about her past, about the missing man whose debts had dragged her down. But he didn't. He wondered if she would ask about his scars, about the brother buried 2 ridges back or the foreman he owed money to. But she didn't. For now, it was enough that neither pressed the other. The sun was slipping low when she finally said, "You can stay on the porch tonight. Coyotes come close after dark." It wasn't an offer made lightly. She never let men near her home if she could help it, but something about the way he'd fixed her door told her he wasn't there to take more than he was given. He nodded once, carried his saddle to the wall, and sat down with the kind of stillness that comes from years of knowing how to wait. She watched him from the doorway, her stomach tight with the worry of what tomorrow might bring, but also with the faintest trace of something she hadn't felt in a long while. Relief that just for tonight she wasn't entirely alone. By the time the sun slipped behind the low ridge, the air had cooled and the land around the cabin had fallen into that quiet where even the wind seemed to wait. The woman lit a lamp inside. The glass chimney blackened at its base, and the light stretched uneven across the single room. She placed 2 bowls on the table, one with beans watered down, so thin the bottom showed clear. She hesitated for amament, then ladled half into another bowl for him. Sharing wasn't something she did often. Food was tight. Every scoop mattered, but if he was going to sit outside her porch all night, she decided he couldn't do it on an empty stomach. He ate without noise, spoon steady, shoulders squared. He didn't complain, didn't ask for more. That unsettled her more than grumbling would have. Most men who came through took what they could, pushing until you either gave or fought. This one seemed to measure his place and hold it. She caught herself wondering if maybe he understood hunger the way she did. If he'd known days when food had to be stretched until it nearly vanished. When the bowls were cleared, he carried his out and rinsed it at the pump without being told. That small act pricked at her chest in a way she didn't want to admit. She reminded herself not to be swayed too quickly. A man who fixed a door and washed his bowl didn't suddenly erase the danger she had faced before. Still, she felt the knot of her nerves loosen slightly. Night deepened. Coyotes began calling in the distance, their howls carrying over the scrub hills. He set himself on the porch step with his hat low, rifle laid across his knees. She lingered inside, folding her arms across her chest, debating whether to lock the door or leave it open. Locking it meant she still didn't trust him. Leaving it open meant she admitted some measure of reliance. Finally, she set the latch, but didn't slide the bolt all the way. A middle ground she could live with. Lying down on her bed, she found sleep wouldn't come. Her body held too much tension, listening for every noise outside. She thought about him, this stranger she'd allowed near her home. She tried to recall the exact reason she'd let him follow her back. Was it only because she needed the door fixed? Or because she had caught something in his silence that felt different from theirs? Her heart raced with the fear that she might have misjudged. If she was wrong, it could cost her everything. Outside, he sat in the dark with a rifle balanced and his ears tuned to the night. He wasn't on her land by chance. He had ridden into that town with nowhere left to go, debts shadowing him, and the knowledge that if he didn't stop somewhere soon, his horse would collapse under him. Sitting there, he thought about the woman inside, her sharp words at the pump, the way she had watched him for weakness, the fact that she still gave him half her supper. He wondered if she had been left behind by someone like himself, a drifter who didn't stay. The thought made his stomach twist. Hours passed. He walked the fence line once, counting each post and scanning for fresh prints, the kind of habit a man carried from too many years watching for trouble. The fence was broken in places, but no one had come through. He returned to the porch and sat again. The coyote calls fading as the night stretched on. Near dawn, she gave up on sleep and pushed the door open. He didn't turn, just shifted his hat back slightly. "You didn't rest," she said. Not quite a question. "Didn't need to," he answered. His voice was rough but steady. Something softened in her expression. She wanted to ask him why he stayed so still, why he guarded a house that wasn't his, why he hadn't asked her for anything in return. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded once and stepped out into the cool air, wrapping her arms tight against her chest. The moment stretched there between them, quiet but heavy. She realized the questions she had been holding back, the ones the town whispered about her, would eventually come. Why was she living alone out here? What had happened to the man she once shared this ground with? Why hadn't she sold the cabin or left with the little she had left? The truth was simple, but not easy to say. Her husband had left debts he couldn't pay, left scars on her body and her trust, and left her name tied to a piece of land no one wanted. Selling at mint. Losing the only anchor she had left, staying mint. Swallowing the shame of being the woman who'd been abandoned. When she looked at him now, she wondered if he'd ask those questions soon, too. But he didn't. He only sat quiet, watching the sun rise over the ridge. For the first time in months, she felt the strange comfort of another pair of eyes sharing the dawn. Not talking, not demanding, just there. And in that moment, she let herself believe that maybe keeping him close, at least for now, wasn't a mistake. By morning, the sun pressed down hot and dry, pulling the last cool from the ground. The man stepped out early, sleeves rolled, moving with the slow steadiness of someone used to work that lasted all day. He went first to the well, tested the rope, and saw the strands near the bucket fray to the point of snapping. He cut them clean and rewound the line with a knot that would hold. The woman watched from the doorway, arms folded against her chest, noting how he worked without asking permission. It bothered her at first. This was her place. The last thing she had any control over, but she couldn't ignore that each thing he touched came back more useful than before. Inside, her thoughts pressed heavy. She wondered if she had been foolish to bring him home, to let him sleep under her roof shadow. She worried what the town might say if they saw him here. Every choice she made was judged harshly by neighbors who pretended not to see her when she came into town. But then she remembered the night, the way he had sat without closing his eyes, the way her fears had eased enough for her to rest at last. That reminder kept her from telling him to leave. He checked his horse's hooves next, finding a stone wedged deep in the left fore. He worked it out with the tip of his knife, then brushed the dust from the animal's flank. The horse breathed easier, shaking its head. It was a small thing, but it showed her something important. This man didn't run from responsibility. Hetton did to what was his, even when no one else was watching. She turned back inside and stirred a pot of oats, thin but warm. Her mind ran restless. She thought about the land, about how the roof leaked and the fence sagged. She thought of the debts left by her husband, how men had come before with papers in their hands and threats on their tongues. She wondered how long she could stand alone before another tried again. A part of her wanted to ask the stranger where he had come from, why he carried such silence. Another part feared the answer, because men with scars and silence often carried trouble in their shadow. He came to the door, then wiping his hands on his jeans, and spoke for the first time that morning. "Your fence won't stand another storm. Posts are shallow, need replacing." His voice was calm, not pushing, just stating fact. She looked at him carefully. "And where do you expect me to get posts? Washbed down the ridge has cottonwood, straight enough for rail. I can cut them." His offer caught her off guard. Men usually asked first what they be paid. He didn't. He only spoke of the work like it mattered to him whether her fence held or not. She narrowed her eyes, trying to read what he wanted from her. When nothing came, no grin, no lean forward, she gave a short nod. "You do that. I'll see what I can make for supper besides beans." That was as much agreement as either of them needed. Later, she walked the edge of the cabinard while he worked. The more she studied the place, the more she saw what she had been ignoring. The roof seemed lifting under the sun. The window pane cracked like a spider's web. The chicken coop with no door, alone. These were problems she managed to live with day by day. But now with another set of eyes and hands, she felt their weight differently, like unfinished tasks that shamed her. She hated the feeling but couldn't shake it. When he returned with cut posts, shoulders damp with sweat, she held out a tin cup of water. He drank slow, careful not to waste a drop. She studied him, then trying to picture his past. She noticed faint scars along his forearm, old burns or cuts that spoke of fights not told. She wanted to ask, but her throat tightened. She feared knowing too much might remind her of what she'd already endured with other men. As the day stretched on, he set posts deep and tamped earth around them with his boots. She patched the coop with boards scavenged from a collapsed shed, her hands blistering as she hammered. They worked near each other but didn't speak much. The silence between them wasn't tense anymore. It was the kind that allowed each to breathe without being judged. That evening, when she brought him supper, jerky with oats stretched into a stew, she finally asked one question that had weighed on her since he arrived. "Why'd you stop here out of all places?" He set down the spoon and looked at her a long moment. Horse was wearing thin, couldn't push him further. "And I've been moving long enough." His answer was simple, but she heard what he didn't say. He had debts, ghosts, and nowhere else left to go. She studied him, then gave the faintest nod. For the first time in years, she thought maybe she wasn't the only one left with nowhere else. When night came, he took his place again on the porch, rifle across his lap. She closed the door, slid the bolt halfway, and sat on her bed with her lamp turned low. Her mind still carried fear. Fear of what tomorrow might bring. Fear of being seen with him? But alongside it grew a thought she hadn't let herself feel in months. If he stayed, if he kept working like this, maybe the cabin wouldn't fall apart so fast. Maybe she wouldn't either. The morning broke sharp and clear. The kind of day that pressed every sound further across the flats. The woman stood by the table with her ledger open, counting what little she had left. A few coins, not enough for everything she needed. She rubbed the edge of one coin between her fingers and felt the weight of the decision. Flour was near gone, salt nearly empty, and the lamp oil wouldn't last through another week. She could stretch the beans and oats, but glass for the broken window and nails for the fence were harder to ignore. She looked at him already outside, saddling his horse, and made a choice that didn't sit easy. She would ride in a town with him. She hadn't gone in with a man since her husband left, and she knew how the town would see it. Eyes would follow, tongues would start, but she also knew how it would look if he rode in alone, buying supplies with her list. The questions would be worse, and she didn't trust anyone there not to cheat him blind. So she cinched her shawl tight, stepped out, and told him flat, "We ride together." He gave no argument, only nodded once, but inside he measured the weight of it. He knew what it meant for her, what it would cost in whispers. He had seen how men at the saloon had looked at her, how quick their eyes sharpened when she passed. Riding beside her would paint a picture in their minds. Still, he accepted it. He wasn't afraid of talk, and if his presence kept hands from reaching for her, it was worth it. The ride was quiet but not empty. Hoofs struck the hard dirt in steady rhythm. She rode with her back straight, chin set, but inside her stomach twisted with worry. She thought of the storekeeper's wife, of the way women in town already kept their distance. She knew some would say she'd taken up with another drifter that she hadn't learned from the last one. She hated giving them reason to speak, but she hated more the thought of walking in alone, weighed down by debts she couldn't pay. When they reached town, heads turned just as she expected. Two men leaned at the saloon rail, the same ones who had watched her days before. Their talk fell silent as she passed, their eyes crawling over her before landing on him. She saw the shift in their faces, the kind of smirk that suggested they thought they knew what bound the two of them together. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her gaze forward. Inside the store, the air smelled of dust and kerosene. The clerk looked at her first, then at him, and paused as though adding up numbers in his head. She set her list on the counter. Flour, salt, lamp oil, nails, and after a pause, a small pane of glass. She braced herself for the clerk's look. Sure enough, he raised a brow, eyes flicking toward the cowboy as if to say, "Another man's paying now." Before she could respond, the cowboy reached into his saddlebag and set down his own coins. Fewer than hers, but enough to cover part of the order. He didn't say a word. She caught herself staring at him, surprised. She had expected him to let her handle it, maybe even step back. Instead, he'd chosen Tostand with her to carry part of the weight. The supplies came bundled in rough paper and twine. He lifted them without being asked, carrying them out into the sun. She followed, her chest tight with conflicting feelings. Pride that she had faced the clerk without flinching. Shame that she needed another man's money. Relief that he had given it without a word. On their way past the saloon, the two men shifted off the rail. One spat in the dirt and called out, "Didn't think you'd bring him home so soon." His tone carried more bite than humor. She froze for a heartbeat, heat rushing up her neck. Her first instinct was to snap back, to throw a barb sharp enough to draw blood. But before she could open her mouth, the cowboy stepped closer to her side, keeping his eyes on the horse he was leading. He didn't look at the man. He didn't answer. His silence was stronger than any insult. She understood then he wasn't the kind of man to feed talk. He was the kind who let silence carry the weight. It steadied her, kept her from saying what would only stir more. Together they walked past, dust rising around their boots, and the men's lauder faded behind them. Back at the cabin, he set the bundles down on the table, then crouched to frame the new glass into the window. With a strip of old cloth and the edge of his knife, he fitted it so it wouldn't rattle in the wind. She watched him from the side, hands busy untying the rest of the supplies. Her heart eased slightly, seeing how each small piece, the glass, the nails, the oil, meant the place would stand stronger. She thought again about what had been left unsaid. He still hadn't told her what debts he carried, who might come looking for him, and she hadn't told him what papers men had brought her before, what promises her husband had sold. But tonight, when the lamp burned steady and the window no longer whistled with wind, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in a long time. Like maybe this place wasn't just waiting to collapse. Maybe with him there it could hold. The next days settled into a rhythm, though neither of them named it aloud. He rose before the sun, checked the horse, and hauled water while the sky was still pale. She cooked oats, thin as broth, and set a small piece of jerky in the pot when she had it, stretching what little they owned. When the heat came down, they worked side by side without ceremony. He drove new posts into the ground, his shoulders steady even when sweat poured down his back, while she patched the coop and planted beans and rows marked by the width of her boot. The silence between them had changed. At first it had been guarded, full of questions neither dared ask. Now it carried something else, acceptance that words weren't needed when work spoke louder. Still at night, when the air cooled and they sat with a lamp burning low, the weight of their unspoken past hung heavy. She knew the listeners of her story, the neighbors, the town, anyone who cared to whisper, would ask why she was alone out here, why she hadn't left when her husband had broken her down and then vanished. And they would ask who this man was, where he came from, and what kind of debt trailed them into her yard. It was late one evening, after the day's work had left their hands raw, that she finally gave some of the answers. Her voice was steady, though her eyes fixed on the wall instead of him. "He came here with soft talk," she said, meaning her husband. "Told me we'd have land worth keeping. But the land never mattered. Damn. Only the bottle did. Sold the last cord of wood one winter for whiskey. Left me with an empty stove and bruises to carry to the pump the next morning." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself on. "When he vanished, he left more than deaths. He left his name tied to mine. Every time men come with papers, they tell me I don't own what I'm standing on." The cowboy sat forward, elbows on his knees, listening without shifting. His face didn't change, didn't twist with pity or surprise. She was grateful for that. She had no use for pity. When his silence stretched, he spoke, his voice quiet and slow. "My debt's to a foreman back in New Mexico. Loaned me a horse after mine was shot out from under me. Said I'd pay him back after the cattle drive. But the drive ended in a fight. Wasn't mine to start, but I finished it. Sheriff ran me out before I could square what I owed. Been moving ever since." He looked down at his hands, the scars across his knuckles catching the light. "My brother, he's buried under a ridge with no name. I keep moving because standing still makes me remember too much." She studied him then, really studied him. Not the drifter she first thought. Not the man who might take advantage the way others had. He was a man carrying weight the same way. She was different shapes, same burden. She felt her chest ease, though part of her feared letting it. Trust had burned her before. The questions that listeners might still hold. Why trust a stranger? Why not send him on? She answered for herself that night. Because the nights were too long to keep alone, because two pairs of hands could fix what one pair couldn't, and because for the first time in years, someone sat across from her who didn't look at her as property or weakness. The lamp burned lower. She shifted her chair back close enough to hear the steady sound of his breath. He didn't press closer, didn't reach for her. That restraint, more than anything, told her what kind of man he was. She turned down the wick and let the room fall dark, her heart calmer than it had been in months. Outside, the coyotes held again, but this time, with him sitting watch at the door, she found she didn't flinch. The heat of late afternoon clung to the ground when a sound of hooves carried down the dirt path. She stepped out to the porch, wiping her hands on her skirt, her chest tightening as soon as she saw the rider. He wasn't from town. His horse was better fed, the saddle polished, the kind of gear that spoke of money and backing. His seat in the saddle was upright, confident, like a man who expected people to make room when he came through. The cowboy followed her gaze, pushing himself off the rail where he'd been working a length of rope. He didn't reach for his rifle, not yet. Both his eyes tracked the stranger with a stillness that said he was already weighing distance, speed, and outcome if things turned bad. The rider drew up at the fence, tipped his hat with a smile too wide to mean respect. "Afternoon, ma'am. I'll keep this short." He leaned down, pulled a folded paper from his vest, and tossed it onto the porch boards. Your husband signed this lien years back. Cabin and ground belong to the man I ride for. You've been squatting on borrowed dirt. Time's up. Her stomach churned at the words. She hated how quickly the shame came back, how fast that old wound opened. Her husband's debts always circling back like vultures. She picked up the paper, unfolded it, her hands shaking, though her face stayed hard. She could read enough to know the signature was real, but her eyes caught the missing details. No seal, no stamp, no witness marks, just ink on cheap paper. He's gone, she said flat. If your man wants to collect, he'll have to dig him out of the desert. The rider smirked, settling deeper into the saddle. We don't dig, we burn. If you're not out by week's end, fire will do the talking. He tapped his horse with his heel, turning half away as if the matter were already decided. Before she could snap back, the cowboy stepped forward, voice low and even carrying weight without needing to rise. Paper's worthless. No stamp, no county seal, just a name scratched by drunk. Any judge would laugh it out of court. You come back, bring something real, otherwise you're just a thief carrying empty threats. The rider turned his head, measuring the cowboy now. He hadn't expected resistance, not like this. For a long second, the air felt stretched thin, the kind of silence before trouble starts. But the cowboy didn't flinch, didn't move his hand to his revolver. He just stood steady, shoulder square, gaze fixed. That steadiness made the rider shift in his saddle. He wasn't looking for a drawn-out fight today. With a tug on the reins, he spat into the dust and rode off, leaving the trail marked with hoof prints and tension that would linger long after the dust settled. She leaned against the porch post, her legs unsteady, though she refused to show it. The paper crumpled in her grip, sweat dampening the edges. They'll come back, she said, voice hard, but carrying the crack of fear beneath. Men like that don't leave things alone. He took the paper from her hand, folded it once, and tucked it under a heavy kettle inside the cabin so the wind wouldn't carry it off. Then we'll be ready, he said simply. No promises he couldn't keep. No false comfort, just fact. What lingered unsaid hung heavy. Who exactly was backing the rider? How much trouble the debt might bring? Whether the marshal in town would stand with them or turn away? She wondered if she should pack and leave. If maybe holding on to this patch of ground was more curse than encore. But when she looked at him steady, unshaken, she found herself pushing that thought down. For the first time, it didn't feel like she was standing against it all alone. That night, she sat awake at the table while he cleaned his rifle by lantern light. The scrape of the cloth against the barrel filled the silence. She studied him, wondering why he stayed, why he hadn't written on after fixing her door, why he hadn't taken the coin she still owed him in meals and left. The questions pressed at her chest, but she didn't ask. Instead, she poured in the last of the coffee, thin as water, and he nodded once in thanks. For listeners wondering why she hadn't folded when threatened, why she hadn't taken what little she had in Ron, the answer lay in the tight set of her jaw, the scars Nuon could see. She had been chased enough in her life. This ground, cracked and rough as it was the last thing she could still claim as hers. And now, with him beside her, she thought maybe it was worth fighting for. The morning after the rider's visit, the woman didn't touch her breakfast. She kept her hands busy instead, sweeping the floor, though it was already clean, shifting jars on the shelf, though nothing had changed inside them. The cowboy watched from the porch, finishing his coffee slow. He didn't need to ask what was running through her mind. The tension in her shoulders said enough. By midday, she folded the paper into her shawl and said flat, "We're taking this to the marshal." It wasn't a question. Sheik knew some in town would tell her to leave it alone, that the cost of fighting men with money was more than she could afford. But she also knew she couldn't live waiting for the strike of a match on her wall. The ride into town was quieter than the last. She kept her chin high, eyes forward, but inside her stomach twisted. What if the marshal turned them away? What if the law wasn't enough? She knew listeners might wonder why she trusted the marshal at all, given how the town had looked the other way when she carried bruises to the pump. The truth was simple. The law might not care about her, but it did care about fraud. If that paper was worth nothing, she needed the marshal to say it aloud where others could hear. The marshal's office smelled of tobacco and old wood. He was a broad man with gray at his temples, eyes sharp from years of seeing trouble come through town. He read the paper slow, lips moving as he traced the words. Then had tapped the edge of it against the desk. "Worthless," he said. "No county seal, no witness, no record in my books. Whoever's waving this around is trying to scare you into walking away." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his chest. That would be Rollins' work. He's been pulling stunts like this for years, selling the same patch of ground to anyone fool enough to believe him. Keeps his hands clean by sending men like the one you saw yesterday. Her jaw clenched, so he gets away with it. The marshal shook his head. Not this time. Word is he's already tried the same trick on a cattle buyer up north. If that buyer makes a complaint, Rollins will have a rope around his neck before long. Until then, I can't promise he won't send more boys to rattle you. But I can tell you this. Your claim to that cabin's stronger than his paper. It wasn't comfort, not really, but it was truth. And truth was what she needed. When they stepped back into the street, the town's eyes were on them again. She felt the heat of the stairs, the whisper of voices just loud enough to sting. A woman walking beside a drifter with a paper in her shawl. That was enough to feed talk for weeks. She kept her head up anyway, gripping the shawl tighter. The cowboy bought lumber with a few coins he had left, second-hand lock, a sack of barley for his horse. He didn't explain, didn't ask for her say, but when they returned to the cabin, she saw the sense in it. He dug new post holes deeper, set rails with plate washers so they wouldn't shake in the wind. She sanded the door until it closed flush, then fitted the lock he bought. Together they carried the boards to frame a new step, stronger than the last. For the first time in years, the cabin began to look like more than a place left behind. The coop had a door that swung without sticking. The window held a clean pane of glass, and the corral rails stood firm. To anyone riding up, it no longer looked like a forgotten patch of ground. It looked like a place kept. That night, she noticed something she hadn't before. The way the air inside felt different, less hollow. The lamp burned steady without wind slipping through the cracks. She found herself breathing easier, though. She wouldn't admit it out loud. For listeners wondering why she let him stay, why she allowed him to shape her cabin as if it were his own, the answer had become clearer in the small things. Because he worked without asking for thanks. Because he gave without pressing for return. Because in a world where so many men had taken, he was one who built. When the lamp burned low, she caught him running a hand along the new frame of the door, testing the lock once more before stepping out to the porch. She watched him through the crack. And for the first time since her husband vanished, she thought maybe this ground wasn't just a burden to survive on. Maybe with him here, it could be something more. The days after their visit to the marshal passed without riders on the trail, but the quiet didn't feel safe. She woke each morning bracing for the sound of hooves or fists on her door. The memory of that false lean sitting heavy in her chest. He noticed the way her eyes tracked the horizon more often now, how she checked the latch twice before turning in at night. He didn't press her about it. Instead, he threw his weight into the work, making the cabin stronger one small job at a time. By late afternoon on the fourth day, clouds built along the western ridge, black and heavy. He stood in the yard watching the sky jaw set. "Storm's coming," he said, though she already knew. The air was thick, the kind that pressed on your chest before the rain even fell. Inside, she hurried to clear the shelves, setting jars low where they wouldn't fall. He climbed to the roof with wire and nails, forcing the tin sheets to hold tight against the wind. Each hammer strike echoed through the valley, sharp against the growing howl of the storm. She dragged rugs away from the thresholds, knowing the water would find its way in no matter how they fought it. The first drops came big, slapping the dirt hard enough to kick up dust before the ground gave way to mud. The wind turned savage, rattling the walls, pulling at the corners of the roof. She braced herself against the door when it shook under the pressure, heart pounding, memories of nights when her husband's rages had battered the same door flashing through her mind. This was different. No man to fear now, only the storm, but the body remembered. He came down from the roof, soaked, eyes narrowed against the rain, and shoved the table against the window frame. "Lantern low," he told her. She lit it just enough to hold back the dark. Together, they moved in silence, sealing what cracks they could, shifting what needed saving. When a boar in the corral snapped with a sound like gunfire, she flinched, but he grabbed his rifle and lantern and went out into the gale to check. She pressed against the door, watching his shadow move across the yard, her stomach in knots. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't come back, but then he pushed inside again, soaked through, breath steady. Horses calm, rail held. The storm howled on long into the night. Rain bled through seams in the roof, dripping into the pans she placed just in time. She sat at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of water she didn't drink, her eyes fixed on a lantern flame. He sat across from her, rifle across his knees, watching the door as if daring the storm attested. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It was shared endurance. She thought of the questions anyone listening to her story might ask. Why hadn't she left when she saw how fragile this cabin was? Why stay on a patch of land that seemed cursed to break her? The answer was in the way they faced this storm. Two people standing against it together, not one breaking alone. When the wind finally eased near dawn, she realized she hadn't slept at all. He hadn't either. They stepped outside into the gray light, mud sucking at their boots, the yard torn but still standing. The roof had held, the corral hadn't collapsed. The cabin was scarred but whole. For the first time in years, she felt something like victory. Not because the storm had passed. It always did, but because she'dn't faced it alone. She looked at him, water dripping from his hat brim, exhaustion written plain across his face. He gave a small nod and she returned it. No words needed for both of them. It was the same thought. If they could outlast this storm, maybe they could outlast what else was coming. The morning after the storm broke clean and sharp. The sky was washed pale, the air carrying that rare sweetness left behind when the land had been beaten and cooled. She stepped out barefoot onto the porch, letting her toes sink into the damp wood. For a moment she stood still, breathing deep, looking at the cabin that had held. The walls stood straighter. The roof hadn't buckled. The fence still marked a boundary. It was the first time she had seen her home, not as something falling apart, but as something worth keeping. He came around from the corral, sleeves rolled, leading the horse by the reins. The animal looked calmer, the barley from town already filling its ribs. He patted its neck, then tied it to the rail with a knot he knew would hold. When he looked up at her, he gave the faintest smile, a tired one but real. It was the closest she had seen to ease on his face since he arrived. By midday, the marshal rode up, dust rising from his trail. He dismounted slow, his boots sinking in the soft ground. He carried no paper, no weapon drawn, just the plain authority of a man who'd seen too many disputes play out the same way. "Rollins has been caught," he said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Try to sell a false claim to a cattle buyer in Santa Fe. Buyer pressed charges. He'll stand in court next week and likely won't ride free again." He looked between the woman and the cowboy, his gaze steady. "That lien you were shown dead is the man who signed it." She felt her chest loosen. For years, she had carried the fear of men arriving with papers, of losing the last ground she had. Now the fear was gone. No one could claim this cabin but her. Her shoulders straightened, her voice steadier than it had been in a long time. "Then this land is mine." The marshal nodded once. "Yours." He climbed back on his horse, tipped his hat, and left them in the silence of their yard. The cowboy turned to her, waiting. Heck knew what came next wasn't his choice to make. She studied him for a long moment. The memory of all that had happened between them pressing against her chest. The sharp words at the pump, the nights he'd kept watch without closing his eyes, the way he'd rebuilt her door, her fence, her faith that this place could stand. She thought of what listeners might still ask. Would he leave now that the danger was gone? Would she let him? Could either of them bear to return to the loneliness that had nearly broken them? She broke the silence first. "You could keep moving? Debts behind you? Storms ahead where you could stay. This place could use another pair of hands." Her voice was calm, but her heart hammered. He looked at the cabin, the fence line, the corral. Then he looked back at her. "I'm tired of moving," he said simply. "If you'll have me, I'll stay." Something eased inside her, then deeper than relief. She nodded once, not trusting herself to say more. That was enough. The days that followed felt different. He signed on part-time at the livery in town, working honest hours for honest pay, the kind that didn't carry debts behind it. She bartered her washing for 3 hens, their soft clucking filling the yard with a sound that made the place feel alive again. Together they carved their initials on the inside edge of the door, small and private, not for others to see. At dusk, they walked the fence line side by side, checking each post. When the air turned cold, he set his coat across her shoulders without needing to be asked. She leaned against him for a moment longer than before, resting her forehead against his chest. No words passed between them because none were needed for those who might have wondered if they would end in ruin. If the debts or the threats would chase them down, the answer lay plain in the life they now built. The cabin stood, the debts no longer chased. The ground was theirs. There were no questions left, no shadows unspoken. That night they shared coffee strong enough not to taste stretched. The lantern burned warm against the walls. She lay down asleep without Arifel across her legs, and he rolled his bedroll out not on the porch but under the same roof. The storm had passed. Therators were gone, and what had begun as suspicion had become something steadier than either of them had expected. The Wild West was still hard, still unforgiving. But in the silence of that cabin stood two people who had chosen to stay.